All right, so excited today. Today we have on Matthew Dix. Matthew, welcome to StoryHinge.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, as a novice storyteller myself, I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you, and I've been able to spend time in reading your book, Storyworthy, and learning about storytelling on that side. I guess first, let me just ask you, why storytelling for you? Why storytelling at all?
Well, I mean, I started sort of on a whim. It was it was the Moth, really. The large storytelling organization that stretches across the country and around the world now. My friends sort of thought I would be a good storyteller at the Moth. That they said things like, "You've had the worst life of anyone we know, so you'll be a great storyteller." Which is not the nicest thing to say about your friend, and is not true. I certainly have had a wonderful life. And continue to have a wonderful life. But, it was my friends initially that sort of encouraged me to give it a try. What I discovered in telling those stories and becoming successful at it is that no matter what you do, truly, no matter what you do, storytelling can assist you in doing that thing better.
Hmm.
I am shocked how often someone comes into one of my workshops with something entirely new in terms of the reason they wanted to be there and how it's going to help them. So why storytelling? Really, it's for every single person. It does all the things that the subtitle of my book talks about. Engage, teach, persuade, and change your life. Truly, all of those things can happen through storytelling.
Hmm. And for you personally, what have you found in storytelling as you've been able to tell these stories, I guess,
Well,
internally?
yeah, I mean, one of the things I like to say is that I'm a fundamentally unlikable person who tells a good story. And I don't, my wife would say that's not true, but there's a little bit of truth perhaps within it. For me, when I am able to tell stories, whether I'm on a stage or I'm on a golf course or I'm having dinner with friends, it's an opportunity to connect to other human beings.
Hmm.
One of the most remarkable things that happens to me is I'll stand on a stage somewhere and tell a story about something that maybe most people don't talk about, expresses some vulnerability and some unusual honesty. And then I'll step off that stage and someone will come up and share a secret that I really can't believe they would share with me, a stranger. And, it's because I open up a space of safety and vulnerability and connection where suddenly they feel like they can tell me something that they've never told anyone else in the world. And I'm a complete stranger other than, maybe 10 minutes that they heard me talk about my life, and suddenly they want to share their life with me. So that's been really one of the wonderful aspects that I never expected to happen when I began telling stories.
And how did you get to be a vulnerable storyteller yourself? I've heard some of your stories, and you say, you share some pretty personal things in your life. How do you get to that point?
Yeah, for me, I've always just been that way. One of my friends described me once as, he said, "You live out loud." Basically, whatever happens to Matt, he's willing to say it out loud. And that's kind of true. I think if we're really being honest, I've always shared my life because as a kid, I really didn't get the attention that I sort of wanted from parents and other folks. I was in Brazil once and I was teaching storytelling to kids, to teenagers in a school. And I was in an auditorium with about 900 people and I was taking questions. And a kid asked me, just a teenage girl said, "You write novels and you write books and you speak on stages and tell stories and you do all these things." She said, "Why do you have to put so much stuff out into the world?" And it was the first time anyone had asked me that question. And I said, in front of all those kids, I said, "I think I'm trying to get the attention of a mother who never gave me any attention and is now passed away, and the attention of a father who left home when I was 7 and sort of never came back."
Hmm.
And I don't think that's entirely the truth, but I think that's sort of where it started. The idea that I just couldn't get what I wanted as a kid, and I found that when I told stories about myself, especially the ones that were embarrassing or the moments of ridiculous failure, those were the stories that people were drawn to. Even as a kid, I discovered that, and I think I've been doing it ever since.
I mean, even to share that with those kids, I don't know if I'd share that, but I probably hold back and say, I can't tell the kids that this is really why I'm sharing stories, but maybe I'll think about it later on. So that really shows a lot of that your willingness to be vulnerable and to be authentic out there. So
Yeah, as soon as I said it, I told them, I said, hold on for a second. I think I'm having one of those moments that might be a story someday.
Uh,
And then I went, no, I think that's right. I think I'm probably right in what I said. Yeah, but it's true. I live out loud. The things that come into my head come out. It doesn't always work well for me. There are moments where my mouth gets me into trouble, but more often than not, it doesn't. More often than not, it helps me.
Oh, that's good. So, you know, I've also been playing with this idea and through the podcast, what is a story? What makes a good story? I guess I've heard you talk about it. What's the difference between anecdote and story?
Sure. I guess what I would say is most people think that a story is stuff that happened to you told in chronological order. So it's sort of you come back to work on Monday and you tell someone what you did over the weekend and you think you're telling a story. But really what you're doing is just offering an itinerary of events that happened over the course of time. And that's essentially what an anecdote is here's some stuff that happened to me. It's probably funny, but it's just stuff that happened to me. I think a story is a moment of realization or transformation in our lives. It's a moment when we either suddenly realize something that we didn't know before, about ourselves or the world or someone else, or we change in some fundamental way. I used to be this, but now I'm that. And I don't think those changes or realizations have to be very large or enormously profound. I think actually the smaller ones tend to even be more interesting to people, tend to be more relatable. So stories for me are things that show that change. That I think that's what people connect to, the idea that we're constantly evolving. And it's not always a positive, evolve. Sometimes it's a story about I used to be a pretty good guy, but it turns out now I'm a pretty terrible guy. That's a great story. So that's the difference for me between, the kind of story that you tell your buddies that makes them laugh, but doesn't really fundamentally say anything about yourself, versus something that's a little more important, a little more profound.
So the first time you went to the Moth, got up on stage and told a story, was that good experience for you? Was it bad? How did that go? Because I've done that myself. So I'm kind of curious what it was like for you.
Well, when I went, I dropped my name in the hat and I sort of hoped my name wouldn't get picked at that point. I was in New York and I suddenly realized there was 200 hipsters in the room, and man buns and side eye. And, I was really terrified. My wife was with me, thankfully. So I was the 10th name chosen that night, the last name. And really at that point, when they had chosen the 9th name and I hadn't been picked, I was sort of already mentally driving home, happy as a clam that I wasn't going to have to be on stage. So they pulled my name 10th, and at first I didn't move because it occurred to me that no one in the room knows who I am. So if I just sit quietly and still, they'll move on to someone else eventually. But my terrible wife was with me that night, and she informed me that was my name. And thanks to her, truly, I'm not sure if I would have gotten on stage if it hadn't been for her. I got on stage, and I hated every minute of that night until I got to the microphone and began speaking. The moment I started speaking into that microphone, I knew it was a place that I was supposed to be. And I won my first slam, so I'm that jerk who went and, did it the first time. And I'm competitive in a way that you can't even begin to imagine. Despicably competitive. And so the fact that I could go tell stories and someone would determine whether I was the winner or the loser was just really fascinating to me. So I was hooked at that point.
And how long ago was this when you started doing this?
2011, July of 2011. Okay. So not that long ago. I like to tell people I'm not that far into it. Today I travel truly the country and the world teaching story and performing, but I've been doing it for 8 years. And I didn't grow up in a family of storytellers. I really grew up with parents who were sort of always in the other room through a cloud of secondhand smoke. They were like the parents in a Charlie Brown cartoon, sort of wah, 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 not really interacting with me. So, I like to let people know that you don't need to have grown up on the lap of a storyteller. And it's not a craft that you have to study for 25 years to become good at. It's something that you can get really proficient at very quickly if you apply, I think, some of the strategies that I teach and some of the skills that I teach and you practice. I think it can happen fast for you.
Okay. No, definitely. I'm going to totally recommend your book to my audience and your story worth the book. And I'll make sure there's links and stuff to that because, like I said, I've been in this area for really coming up on 3 years now. And it's one of the top books I found in terms of just giving you some real fundamentals on storytelling. And if you follow these things that you teach, I think you're probably 100 times better storyteller if you just follow those things.
I agree. I agree. I don't think it takes much. You know, I'm an elementary school teacher, and I've been
Mm,
teaching for 20 years. And so when I looked at storytelling in terms of the book, what I did was the same thing I do with students in my classroom. I took large, large concepts and big processes, and I broke them down into very small, repeatable steps that could be applied to every story.
mm,
And I structured the book in such a way that the most important content comes first in the book. So if you read half the book and then ignore the back half of the book, you're still going to be really good. Which is the same way we teach kids. We teach the most important things first because people tend to pay attention to the things that come out first, and attention spans drift as you get to the end of a lesson.
mm.
So it's different than a lot of the teaching that I've seen in terms of storytelling. I know a lot of great storytellers who teach storytelling, but what I've discovered is what they often do is they either explain how they prepare stories, which is not really helpful if you're not exactly like them,
Mm,
or they can tell you how to make that story you have better, but they're only really improving the story that you're telling at the moment and not all your future stories. My
okay.
goal was to have you read a book and then have strategies that you can apply to stories for the rest of your life, and they're very simple and repeatable and practicable.
Okay. How'd you go about figuring that out? I mean, is it just listening to stories? Was there, because I'm a process engineer, so I'm always curious about the process behind the scenes, that how you got there to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, when I started telling stories, it sort of came natural to me. Although, I said that once in a workshop that my wife was at, and she corrected me quickly. Part of it was that I've been teaching for 20 years. So every day I stand in front of a group of 10-year-olds, the worst audience in the world, and I have to hold their attention. And one of the ways I do it is I tell them stories all the time.
Mm,
I've also been a wedding DJ for 20 years. So for 20 years, I've stood in front of strangers and spoke extemporaneously, trying to get their attention and to get them to do the things I need them to do. And that really helped a lot. And I'm a novelist. I've been writing since I was 17 years old. I haven't missed a day of my life in terms of writing, and I've published 4 novels. And I didn't think that had any bearing on storytelling until I started teaching it. And then I heard people telling me their stories, and I wondered, why would they ever craft the story that way? It doesn't make any sense. And I
mm,
came home one night and I said to my wife, "What? These people don't make any sense to me. I don't understand why they think that this is a good story." And she said to me, "I don't know, Matt. You've been writing stories for 20 years. Maybe they haven't. Maybe you figured out something over the course of time that they haven't figured out yet because they haven't been writing like you have." And I think she had good points in terms of all of that. So I was already sort of good at storytelling, but hadn't thought about the process until I had to teach it. And
mm.
once I started teaching it, I discovered that I had to break the things down that I did. And so I first analyzed everything that I did in terms of storytelling and found ways to make it small for everyone to understand and repeatable. So the things that came naturally to me, I had to really examine closely. And that's how I built the curriculum.
Okay. No, it's really good. I do want to jump into a little bit of this because I know sometimes we think, well, I don't have a good story, right? Or you think that it's that big story. I don't have these big events in my life. Nothing's happened that significant that I have a story to tell. And I know you have something to say about that.
Yes, I do. Well, I don't think those big stories are often the best stories to tell. They're certainly not the easiest stories to tell. You know, I have had a life that has been unusual in terms of events that have taken place. I was twice in my life, paramedics have saved me. They've brought me back to life after my heart
Mm,
had stopped beating and I stopped breathing. And I was arrested and tried for a crime I did not commit. I spent time in jail. I was homeless for a period of my life. I've had those big stories. They're
mm,
not my favorite stories to tell, though. Those are the stories that my friends thought would make me into a great storyteller. But I know now that the best stories are about small moments in our lives. Because if I was to tell you the story about the time I went through the windshield and died on the side of the road and was saved by paramedics, you and I aren't going to connect on a going through the windshield level.
yep.
Right? You're not gonna think, yes, Matt, I know what it's like to go through a windshield. You're right, it really sucked.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, can't help you there.
right. So
Mm,
those big stories are hard to tell. When I have a big story like that, I have to find a small moment within the large story, or it's just going to be a big story that won't really mean anything to anyone. So I have to find a way to make it relatable and connectable, which is challenging. So what I'd much prefer to tell is a small story, something little that happened to me that everyone will sort of understand. And through that little moment, I'll craft some meaning and some humor, maybe, and some suspense. And people will like that story better than the story of my trial or my arrest or my homelessness. Those are much harder stories to understand. And I don't know if people like them as much, if we're being honest. I think most of the time people like my little stories.
So by little, you mean like these little moments of transformation, this change moment? Is that what you're talking about? And then
Yeah.
you build around
Yeah.
that moment?
Yeah, they're really tiny. I mean, once you get attuned to them, you see them all the time. One that I haven't worked on yet, but I sort of love, that I've been thinking about a lot, is this past summer. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I got a 6-year-old son. And my daughter's in the 90th percentile in terms of height. She's tall. She's like this tall, lanky thing. And my son is in like the second percentile of height, so he's tiny. So I can pick him up. He's like nothing, you know. So I pick him up with one hand. I flip him around. And so one morning I'm in my back room and the sun's coming in. It's like 6 in the morning. Sun just came up and I'm holding my son Charlie. And I put him down and my daughter comes over to me and says, "Uppy, Daddy," like she wants me to pick her up.
Mm.
And she's really tall and lanky and heavy. Like it's awkward to hold her. And I said, "All right." So I pick her up and I'm holding her for a minute and I've got a torn ligament in my foot. It's already hurting and she's just heavy. So I go to start to put her down and she shoves her face right in the crook of my shoulder and neck. And she whispers to me, she says, "It's so nice to be held like this, Daddy." And it occurs to me
Mm.
that I'm the only person who holds her like this anymore. She's gotten too big for my wife or her grandparents to pick her up. I'm going to be the last human being to ever hold her like a little girl. And so instead of putting her down, I hold her until she tells me to put her down. And that's just a moment that I have with my daughter. That's small. That's common in terms of parents. Kids say things like that to us all the time. But I know when I craft that into a story, into some 4 to 6 minute little gem, that it's going to make every parent in the room cry. And I know I can weave in some humor with some anecdotes before or leading up to that moment. I just know it's a great moment to talk about because everyone's going to understand that moment. Even if you don't have kids, you understand the idea of last moments in lives. You know, the last time you do something can often be difficult if you recognize it for what it is. So that's better, I think. That's a story I'm more excited about than the story of the time I was in jail, because it's just something people are going to understand. I find those moments all the time.
How do you start capturing those moments? Because that's what takes. When I hear that, it's like that's an intent of mine. Many of us would go through that moment and it would pass, and we wouldn't even, we'd be gone, perhaps,
Right.
or maybe we might remember it, maybe not.
Yeah, I used to be the same way. I say that we sort of live our lives and we have these wonderful moments, and we sometimes see them. More often than not, we don't see them. And even if we do see them, so often we just throw them away like trash. We don't consider them. And then suddenly a week, a month, a year goes by and we have barely anything to remember from it. So, you know, maybe now 5 years ago, I gave myself a homework assignment because I'm an elementary school teacher. It's my tendency. I was worried that I was going to run out of stories to tell and that I wasn't going to be able to take a stage anymore. And I didn't want to be one of these storytellers who rolls out the old chestnut every time they're on stage. I know those guys. I'm not a fan of those guys. So I said to myself, at the end of every day, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to ask myself, what's the most story-worthy moment from my day? What is the thing that made this day different than every other day? Even if the moment isn't actually story-worthy, even if it's not worth ever crafting a story from at all, I'm going to force myself to at least find a moment and train myself to find them. And I don't write them down in their full form because nobody would do that. That's a journaler. Those are people who only write after a breakup before they find love again, you know? So what I did is I used Excel. I just have a spreadsheet and it's 2 columns and that's it. It's a date column on the left and that B column stretches across the screen. And that's the amount of room I allow myself to write the moment that I have. Today, I find multiple moments in a day quite often. But back then, I wasn't really finding anything for a while. My goal was to find one new story a month. And if I did that, I thought I was doing great. 2 stories a year would be amazing. But what happened is over the course of time, by asking myself every single day, what's my most story-worthy moment of the day, I developed this lens for storytelling that I didn't have. I became attuned to the fact that your daughter shoves her face into the crook of your neck, and you realize not only could this be a story, but I'm really having a meaningful moment with my daughter that I never want to forget. And so in that spreadsheet, it says something like 6 a.m. I just held Charlie. He's light as a feather. Clara wants to get picked up. I pick her up. She's heavy. I go to put her down. She says that beautiful thing to me. I realize I'm the last adult who's ever going to hold her like a little girl. And that's all it says. But that is enough for me to get back to that moment, remember that moment, and someday tell that story. And now today, I just see them all the time. And I give this homework assignment to every workshop participant, and it's in my book, and I do a TED talk on it, and we talk about it on my podcast. And it's no exaggeration that every single day I receive at least 2 emails from people who have started doing Homework for Life, and it's changed their life. Before we started recording, the last thing I did before I clicked on the link so that we could begin this podcast was I was responding to someone who said, I reached my 100th day with Homework for Life. She was talking about how she just gave the talk at her son's bar mitzvah. She never would have been able to do it if she hadn't been doing Homework for Life and collected stories over time. And she said it's changed the way she lives her life because of it. And at least a couple emails a day from people who tell me that their lives are changed because of it.
That's awesome. Well, I have been doing it for about a month now, so I can't say it's made a huge difference yet. I'm still kind of, sometimes I get, what happened yesterday? I forgot to record last night. What happened yesterday? Let me try to think of something.
Well, I say
I'm getting there.
You got to do it at night before you go to bed, because somehow sleep washes things away. I mean, if we're being honest, I do it throughout the course of the day now. I'm the kind of guy who always has his laptop with him and open wherever he is, or my phone. So as soon as I have a moment, I'm just jotting it down. And at the end of the day, I'm sort of collecting them onto the spreadsheet so that I don't lose them. Because I will also, if I go a day, I won't forget the previous day. So I just don't ever allow that to happen, because I know that is the case. It becomes the last thing I do before I go to bed. Before I head upstairs to my bedroom, I sit down in front of the computer and I say, all right, what do I have from the day? What else do I think about? And the other thing that happens is you'll crack yourself open eventually, and stories will pour out from the past that you have forgotten, things you can't believe that you've forgotten, like really big moments that you just threw away. And now through the process of seeing the world differently, those things come back as well. And suddenly you have more stories than you could ever imagine to tell. You know, my list of currently uncrafted story ideas, just ideas like the one I described to you that I've never done anything with, that list stands at 405 items long. And I haven't even looked at the last year's worth of Homework for Life to pull stories out of that, because the list is so long, I haven't had to go back and look. So I have more stories than I'll ever get to be able to tell, which is a gift.
How do you like whittle it down from there and say which ones you're going to work on and which ones you can't work on quite yet?
Right. It's usually, honestly, it's whatever I'm most excited about is the next story that I want to tell. So, you know, sometimes it's something that has just happened and I just think, oh, I know exactly how to put that story together. Sometimes I have stories that take 3 years to sort of ferment in my mind to sort of figure out the trick to make the story work. And I have a bunch of those that I've told over the years, but truly it's taken me a couple years to just let it roll around in my mind until sort of I find the key to unlock that story and make it work in the way I need it to work. But most often it's just something I'm excited about. And it's either something I've recently found, or the Moth has a theme, and that theme triggers my mind. Oh, I have a story that fits it perfectly. I think it's from like 3 years ago on my Homework for Life, and I go look at the list and I find it, and then it becomes a story.
Okay. Do you have like dedicated time where you're sitting down thinking about these things and trying to work on the stories, or it just kind of happens throughout the day, or how do you do that?
No, I dedicate a time. I'm a big fan in segmenting your day very specifically. I think that's the way we get things done. I don't write my stories out, and I'm the only person I know who doesn't write their stories out. So most people actually have to sit down and write, and I understand that. But for me, because I don't have to write them out, my storytelling work takes place primarily in the shower and while I'm driving my car. Those are two places that I'm sort of alone, and there's no one to bother me and no one to hear the terrible version of the story I'm about to say, because everything is said orally for me. So as I'm working on a story, I'm actually just speaking it out loud, listening to it, deciding if I like it or not, throwing it away if I don't, and then restarting. And so I always work in those two places. I never take a shower without stepping into the shower and thinking, this is the story I'm working on right now, and this is how far into the story I am. And then I step into the shower. And I do the same thing with the car. I put my hand on the handle and I say, what story am I working on? And where am I in that story? And then I get in the car.
Huh. That's fascinating, because I'm surprised as an author, you think you would have to write it and work it out on writing, but it's a different.
I think it's because I'm an author that I don't. My authorial voice, the one I use for novels, is just so different than the voice I use to speak. And when I'm writing a novel, I'm cognizant of sentence structure and punctuation. You know, when we're speaking, we can speak in enormous run-on sentences that will seem completely normal to everyone because we're speaking and not actually seeing it on the page.
Mm.
Like the enormous run-on sentence I'm actually in right now that began probably 25 seconds ago, that you don't really notice as a run-on sentence because we're just having a conversation. But I'm still within that same sentence that I mentioned a moment ago, and I still have yet to reach a marker punctuation other than a comma, and I would never be able to live with that on the page. So for me to put it on the page doesn't work because I think I'm
Mm.
writing novels.
Okay, that makes sense.
I'm
Totally makes
also
sense.
very auditory. I just remember everything that I hear, and that really helps too. Not everyone has an auditory memory. Lots of people have visual memory, so putting
Mhm.
it on the page actually allows them to remember it better. I don't remember anything I see. My wife has told people that if we line up 10 brunettes in a, you know, in a lineup and she's in that lineup, she says he won't be able to pick me out of the lineup, which is not true, but like there's some truth behind what she says. I just don't.
But if she spoke, you could pick her out, right?
Yes, you're totally right. Yes, I remember people by voice more than looks. So I'll be at the Moth and someone will come up to me. It just happened to me. I was just at the Moth on Tuesday night. Someone came up to me, and as they were walking towards me, I realized they know who I am, and I have no idea who they are. And then she said hello, and I knew who she was. I
Mm.
recognized her voice, but not her face.
That's fascinating. What that tells me, you know, and for our audiences, there's probably different ways that we need to work on stories for ourselves. Maybe some of us do need to write. Some maybe our auditory, like you're talking about. There's different process. I found I like going both ways on that, and I become more fascinated with voice and just the sound, and I record myself a lot more now and listen to myself back just to hear. So that's been very helpful as well.
Yes, that's how I preserve my stories, not on the page, but through audio.
Mm.
You know, the one advice I do give to people is I say, try not to write the whole story out word for word because you'll become committed to those words. And I don't memorize my stories, I remember them. So I'm not committing sentences to memory. I'm committing scenes to memory. Oh, first I want to start with this scene, and then I
Mm.
want to move to this scene. I will commit to memory sort of transition sentences and opening sentences and lines that I know are going to be really funny, you know, or suspense building sentences. But most of the time, I'm really just remembering my story. And people who write it word for word are tempted to memorize it word for word. And a memorized story doesn't sound as authentic. It strips out a lot of the vulnerability because really you're not telling a story anymore. You're really presenting a monologue in the
Mm.
same way an actor would present a soliloquy in a play. It's really not that very different. So ideally, I want storytellers to be speaking from the heart, to have some flexibility so that they can, you know, drift away from what they've written on the page when they feel it's appropriate. So I say, don't write the whole thing out word for word, bullet it, you know, somehow outline it, whatever you need to do, write down some sentences, but not all of them. I think that's the best way to go.
Okay, that's good. That's real good. What do you see like some of the top mistakes storytellers do when they get up there?
Their beginnings are always terrible. um, they're just awful beginnings. So often people start with things like, they start with like blanket statements that mean nothing to the story. They start with things like, uh, there are two things I know in this life. One is that I will never be rich, but the other one is that I'll always be rich in love, right? And then they start telling their story, and that sentence is not only forgotten and irrelevant, but it sort of annoyed everybody because, you know, it's the
Yeah.
idea that you know something that we all don't know. You know, it's just crazy. They start with sounds, you know, bam, the door closed. You know, I have this thing called the dinner test, which is the story you tell should be sort of a cousin to the story that you would tell
Mm.
if we were having dinner together. But if you and I were having dinner together and you said, "Hey Matt, how was your day?" and I was going to tell you a story, I wouldn't start with bam, the door closed. That would be weird. And
Yeah, like,
I don't understand why people don't think it's also weird on stage to do the same thing.
that's
Um, you know, and a lot of times they just feel like they have to give us a lot of information before they ever get the story moving. So
mm.
they'll start stories by saying, "Let me tell you something about my mother," which is no one's ever wanted to hear the next sentence of that story. Uh, Rather, I prefer that you get the story going, and then as the story progresses, tell us something about your mother. You
Right.
know, so I like to get stories off the ground. I like to start with forward movement. Kurt Vonnegut said it about his short stories. He said, "I always start as close to the end as possible." I believe in that. I think that's a great piece of advice. Push your story as close to the end as possible. All of those things, just to get it off the ground and moving.
Okay, so like you're saying start off close to where it's going to end, as close as possible to have a complete story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, move it as close to the end as you possibly can. The shorter story is always the better story too. You know, one of the Moth stories I tell that people love the most, it's 4 minutes long, and I know that's why they like it the most. It's not because it's better crafted than any of my other stories. It's not more meaningful. It's not funnier. It's just 4 minutes long, and that feels really good to people. So if you can tell the shortest version of your story, that will be the best version of your story also.
See, that's tough because even 6 minutes feels short. It's like, man, that's already really short.
Right. That's why that 4 minute story is so crazy, because people can't believe how short it is. But I agree, 6 minutes is really hard. We have an organization here in Connecticut where we tell stories. My wife and I produce a show, and we give people an 8-minute limit, and it's a soft 8. So you can go a little long depending on what you're talking about. You know, if you have some crazy story that, you know, involves a lot of content that people will have a hard time grasping, I'll let you go long. But I always say it's easy to tell an 8-minute story. It's really hard to tell a 6-minute story. And the first, 50 stories I ever told to an audience were told at the Moth, and they were all 6-minute stories. So I think it was a great training ground for me in terms of honing and crafting and slicing and really getting every story down to the essentials, which I think is the best way to do it.
One thing that occurred to me as you've been in this and really being I guess I view as a real crafter of the story and a studier of it. Is it hard for you to enjoy some of those stories now because you start analyzing them so much, or is
yeah?
As an engineer, I'm a process engineer. I want to go to analysis pretty quickly, so I find myself doing some of that same stuff. That's why I ask.
I get that question a lot actually now. I do enjoy them a great deal. At the same time, I'm instantly analyzing as well. Now, I know I enjoy them because I'm always moved by them. It's not uncommon for me to have tears in my eyes at the end of a really great story that, that provokes that kind of a reaction. So I can really love stories, while at the same time, there is a part of my brain that is instantly deconstructing it and putting the sections of the story into sort of buckets, and like I'm wondering if the buckets fit together. I'm wondering if that bucket even needs to be there. So I'm sort of doing that mental sort of arithmetic of sorts to see if the story is holding together, if that's the way it should be told, if the chronology of the story makes sense, all of those things. The same thing happens in movies. When I leave a movie, my wife often says to me, don't say anything for 15 minutes. I just want to think that movie was good before you tell me why it wasn't. And so we drive home for 15 minutes, and then she'll turn to me and say, all right, tell me what was wrong. And I tell her, and she says, oh, like, I just wish you wouldn't tell me these things because I wanted to like Wonder Woman. And now you've ruined Wonder Woman for me. It happens all the time.
What do you see? For someone who's kind of been in this art and the rise of the Moth over the years, where do you see this storytelling going? Maybe one question: why do you see it come up at this time in society, and where do you think it might be going?
Well, I think it's important, or why people love it so much, for a bunch of reasons. I think that with the rise of technology and the way we watch things alone so often nowadays, we spend a lot of time watching things on phones and computers, and it's different than when the family used to gather around the television, and at 8 o'clock everyone had to be there to watch that show. It's just very fragmented today, and I think that as human beings, we yearn to be in a collective space and to share a moment together, and I think this is an opportunity to do that. It's the same thing as a concert, right? Except you don't have to deal with a bunch of drunk, depending on what concert I guess you're going to, but it's a little gentler, so it's a gentler sort of concert. So I think that's important. I actually think that the idea of instant gratification in today's world, so I can watch a movie whenever I want, there's no need for me to catch it at a certain time. But when it comes to storytelling, we have a show on February 23rd. And if you don't come to that show on February 23rd, you're never going to be able to experience what happened in that theater that night. And I think that that's become precious for people. I think it's the reason that people watch the Super Bowl, all together and collective, rather than, you can't watch it the next day. Like, that's just not a thing. And I think that's part of why live events are becoming so important to us, because we don't have that experience like we did at home. We don't go into work anymore on a Thursday and talk about what happened on Seinfeld, because no
Mhm.
one's watching the same thing on Thursday night. They're not even watching at the same time anymore. There isn't like, you got to sit down at 9. It's, I watched half of a movie while I was on an elliptical, and then I came home and I watched a little bit while I was cooking dinner, and then I caught the rest of it before bed. You know, it's
Mhm.
just, just a different kind of thing. But you go to a storytelling show, you hear, 5 or 7 or 10 stories. You get in the car, you have something to talk about for hours, because you were all there and you shared that experience.
Yeah. And so you guys started Speak Up, your storytelling. What is that like compared to the Moth? Is it totally something totally different? And I guess why'd you start that? What is it?
Well, we started it back in 2011. I was driving to New York and Boston all the time. I live right in between them, but they're 2.5 hours away
Mm,
from me, each one. So whenever I was going to go tell a story, I was sort of gone for the night. And now I was flying around the country telling stories for the Moth and for other organizations. And there was a day when I just told my wife, there's nothing here in Connecticut. Why don't we do something here too? Then, maybe I won't have to travel as much. I'd travel more, if we're being honest. It was just my attempt to tell more stories. But she agreed. She said, that sounds great, go try that. And I found a theater that agreed to have us, and truly we started Speak Up thinking that twice a year 20 to 40 of our friends would get together and we would share some stories, and that would be lovely. And so our first show, that's what I thought would happen. We'd get 40 people. I gathered 10 of my friends who I thought could tell a story, and we ended up having 180 people show up to that show.
mm,
And we knew we were onto something. So Speak Up for us, it's similar to the Moth. It's a curated show. So that's not an open mic. People pitch us their stories based upon a theme that we determine. We choose the stories, not based upon really the storyteller, but based upon how that story will fit into the arc of the night. And we work with each of those storytellers very closely. If you've ever been to a Moth main stage, which is sort of the more formal version of the Moth, I've done those before. That's a show where you work with the director very closely. So before you ever take the stage, the director knows exactly what you're going to be saying that night.
mm.
And they've chosen 5 stories that work well together. And quite often there's, 2 or 3 really famous people in a Moth main stage. And then there's someone like me, who's just a guy who tells stories on the slam circuit, who has a good story that they can expand to a 12-minute version of that story.
Okay.
And those are beautiful nights. And that's our goal sort of in Speak Up. We have 7 storytellers. I'm always one of them. My wife hosts the show. We bring in audiences between 200 to 500 people, depending on our theater. And I get storytellers from our audiences, people who pitch us. I also teach workshops all the time. And when I'm teaching a workshop and someone tells a story, I'm poaching those stories. I
Mm.
go to the Moth to a story slam. I just was there this week. I heard a beautiful story on the stage. I went up to the woman. I said, "Hi, my name's Matthew Dix." And she said, "I know who you are. I read your book. I listened to your podcast." And I thought, of course, you're my favorite story of the night. You've been following my rules. And so she's going to be in a show of mine in October of this year. So I'm always just looking for stories like that. And occasionally we'll get a famous person. We had Senator Murphy, the Connecticut United States Senator, on our stage
Mm.
a couple months ago. So that was a big night for us. But most of the time it's just regular folks who we teach how to tell stories, and they perform that night.
And you see this continue to grow. Where do you see the storytelling world going?
Uh, Yeah, I mean, for us, I was on the phone today with a theater who wants to bring us in. There's
Mm,
constantly venues who are looking. Quite often, it's sort of a music venue that recognizes that they can do something other than music. So we're doing a lot of that. I don't see an end to it, particularly because I don't see an end to the fragmentation of our lives and the growing isolation that we have in terms of our jobs and the way we consume content and entertainment and all the things I said before. Until that goes away, and I just don't see that going away, I think people are going to crave a shared space and a shared experience, and I think storytelling is a great way to do that.
yeah, and I agree. We don't sit on the porch anymore and chat with our neighbors in the evening or chat with our family in the evening like we used to, and we still have that
Right, that's the
opportunity.
origins of the Moth. Actually, George
Mm,
Dawes Green, the founder of the Moth, he was on an island off the coast of South Carolina, hanging out on a porch with his friends, telling stories. It's called the Moth because the moths would slip through the screens, and they would be the audience for the stories every night.
mm,
And when he came to New York, he brought that spirit and that idea to the city, and that's where the Moth was born.
mm. It's good. Now, I know we tapped into your book here, and you shared a few pieces. That one other place I want to hit on that is this idea of stakes, and maybe give us one tip on how you build stronger stakes within your story to make it a more meaningful story.
Sure. So the idea of stakes is the idea that we have to give our audience a reason to want to hear the next sentence. I would never assume that the audience wants to hear the next sentence, although I think most people just assume they do. I just don't think that's the case. And so stakes are the idea of what is the thing that we are giving the audience to worry or wonder about. You know, it's either going to be early in my story, I'm going to explain to you exactly what I'm hoping to get, you know, by the end of my story, or hoping to learn, or hoping to uncover. It's the thing that is at peril. You know, will Matt be able to do this, or will Matt be able to do that? I need to set those stakes very early in the story to give people an opportunity to worry and wonder about what's going to happen. Otherwise, you end up with a story that starts with something like, let me tell you something about my mother. And there are no stakes in that sentence. There's no reason for me to want to hear that next sentence. But if I open instead with a sentence like, when I was 14, I tried to run away from home 3 times because I hated my mother. Let me tell you something about my mother. Now there's stakes involved, right? There is worry and wonder. When Matt was 14, he tried to run away from home 3 times because of his mother. Ooh, I want to hear about his mother. And it's just that simple. And yet so often it doesn't actually happen in a story where people think about that as they're crafting their story. So I'm always trying to get my audience to want to hear the next sentence, is the idea of stakes.
That's good. Real good. Well, Matt, this has been just real wonderful to talk to you. And like I said, and read your book and gain insights on storytelling. And I want to make sure the audience can connect with you. What's the best place to connect with you, your work, and be able to find your book and your podcast and all that? So
sure. Well, if you go to matthewdix.com, you can basically find everything there. If you want to find our podcast, it's Speak Up Storytelling. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Every week, my wife and I, we host that show. We play a story from our Speak Up archive. We record our shows. So once a week, we play one of those stories and we critique it. We talk about what's working well in the story, what could be improved. We have a homework for life segment where I take a moment from my week, one of my homework for life entries, and we look at it and talk about what I could do with it, how I might craft it into a story, where it came from. It helps people sort of get a sense of how that works. So that's like I said, wherever you get your podcast, you can find that. And you can get my book, hopefully wherever books are being sold. And if it's not there, you should tell that bookseller to get the damn book. You can buy it on Amazon and have it at your home in a day.
Yeah.
I encourage people to buy my book in dozens at a time. You know, that's like eggs. That's a good way to buy books. It's also available on audio, and it's the first book that I've ever recorded myself. My novels are all recorded by professionals, but this is a book that I had to sit in a studio and record. So I've had people who have taken my workshops say listening to your audiobook is like sitting in a workshop with you. So if you prefer that version of it, that's available too.
I recommend that. I've done that as well. And it is nice to hear you, because throughout your book, you tell some of the stories and then you explain what you're doing with that story. To actually hear your voice to go through that, I think it makes it even better. So yeah, I'd agree.
I'm glad. It was an awful process recording it. It was it was sitting alone in a booth for days in Michigan, recording while other people were in the other room, just sort of staring at you and telling you when you didn't sound good. So it was not the easiest job in the world. I'm glad that it worked out. I'm afraid to actually listen to it. I've never listened to the audiobook because I'm just afraid that I'm going to hear something that like, oh, I could have done that better. And then it's going to sit like a stone on my heart for the rest of my life.
To go redo it someday.
No, I'm never again. I will. Maybe I'm working on a new nonfiction book. I'll do my nonfiction, but only if they force me.
All right. Well, Matthew Dix, thank you for coming with us here on StoryHinge and sharing some insights on story. And I'll be following your work, and I'll be helping all the storytellers here in Houston if they want to get better at storytelling. I know where they can go.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks so much. It's been a blast.